Kia ora. Welcome to a series, the first in a series of interviews of interesting people in New Zealand history. And today I have Ron Crosby with me. And Ron, of course, is the author of the Musket Wars, my main reference book. So welcome, Ron. Thank you for joining me today. Great to have you here. I think I'll just start with how we got to know each other, because I sent you a request to buy your book, Gilbert Mair-Te Kūti's Nemesis. And you came back. I think we had trouble with the account or whatever. And I happened to mention that I do droning, etc. And then you came back and said, "You're not perchance the Kiwi Gotcha." And I said, "Yes, I am." And then, of course, you were in the process of doing a book and you needed some droning. So we ended up on a field trip with you at some stage, and we've been corresponding ever since. So, Ron, tell us a little bit about yourself and how the Musket Wars came to be.
Right. Well, the Musket Wars essentially arose out of my father-in-law, Mair-Te Kamariera, who was an Anglican minister, a canon in the Anglican Church, who had a fantastic collection of books, but I didn't really meet him, obviously, until later, a little later when I was at Auckland Grammar. And so we lived here till I was about 12 and then moved to Mount Wellington, where the family engaged in a tomato glasshouse growing operation. And went to Auckland Grammar and met Margie's brother. And
Margie's your wife?
Margie is my wife. And but in essence, at Auckland Grammar at a very young age, a mate and I, a bloke by the name of Dave Storthy, who's a dentist now retired dentist up in Whangarei. He and I, from about the age of 15 or 16 or thereabouts, I can't remember now how old you had to be to buy a rifle in those days, but we used to go down to the Urewera and go deer stalking. And in those days, when I think back now, we were spending roughly 6 to 8 weeks a year in the bush. And we did that all the way through school and university, in the last 3 years of school and university years. But all of that experience here and in the Urewera made the bush very much a warm background for me. It was where we recreated. All our mates tended to be going to the beaches in those days and surfing and etc. So we were a bit unusual. There was another couple of blokes, the Archibald brothers, who we met up with from time to time in the bush, and they were at grammar as well. We'd meet. It was intriguing. We wouldn't plan the trips, but we came across them a couple of times. And so there was this little small group of blokes going down to the Urewera from here, motor scooters or borrowing parents' cars or whatever. I remember driving a motor scooter back from the Urewera once. In those days, it was gravel road over the Mamaku Ranges to Rotorua, gravel from there to Murupara, and the road to Murupara from the Kaingaroa was twisty, gravelly road.
You're going deer stalking?
Yeah, with a rifle.
How did you bring your deer back?
Rifle over your shoulder, strapped on the back of the motor scooter. When coming home, I remember taking 13 hours to come home on a little Pook motor scooter once. Yeah, but they were neat years. Employment was full for Tūhoe in the Urewera in those days. You could leave your vehicle on the side of the road for 2 weeks, no problem. And so that gave me a good background in terms of country and appreciation of country, appreciation of how rivers ran, etc., ridge lines and the like, and stood me in good stead for that, the books in later years. Then went to varsity here in Auckland, qualified in law, but very interested in languages and history, and then through Margie's brother Peter, met Margie, and we were married, and after a few years we started having children, and we decided that we wanted to raise them out of Auckland. Auckland, at that stage, I remember Auckland getting to 250,000. I remember it getting to 300,000 very quickly, and that was around about when we left, and the early 1970s. And we went down to Blenheim and we've been there since. And so I've done a lot of country, just trips in the high country down there. But in essence, what happened was in 1980, unfortunately, Manga Titoki Kamariera, who was Margie's father, came down on a trip, staying with us, and he died at our place. And
was he expected to die?
No, he was a very fit, lean man, strong, and he was 63 or 65, and just had a sudden heart attack. And but anyway, his widow Nora, who was a Pākehā woman, she took me into his office up here in Auckland when they had the tangi. Tangi went for days, and he was highly respected.
In Auckland here?
Oh, right. He was highly respected, and it lasted for 3 or 4 days, I think, from memory. And
because his iwi is further up north.
Right? Yeah, he's Te Rarawa, Te Aupari, and his Margie's grandfather was Te Aupari with, I think, some Ngāti Maru, and which would have related to the Musket Wars, and that linkage. And but his mother was Te Rarawa, particularly, and so they were born in Kūpapa, and Manga was one of, I think, 11 children, born in a little mud-floored whare, etc., and speaking only te reo. But he was that part of that generation who, when they got to school, got belted for speaking te reo, etc. Highly intelligent man, ended up speaking Greek, Russian, English, obviously. Went to Te Āti, went to St Stephen's and Te Āti, and the ultimate Māori, and the great Māori orator, etc. But here he was speaking beautiful English.
You were saying his funeral was here in Auckland?
Well, the tangi was held here at I can't remember the name of the church now, up in Kaiwa Pass, Māori community, Anglican community church, with a big hall.
But his body was taken up?
No. He was buried at his own request at Mangere. So he lies at Mangere now, and which was unusual. And the rest was whānau, and now still up at Rangihahukaha, which is the name of their church opposite Pukaputa Marae. So Pukaputa is their marae, Te Rarawa there's 2 marae at Pukaputa, which is just south of Kaitaia, between Kaitaia and Ngāhi and Te Rarawa is the name of their marae, which is the same name as the iwi.
So you were saying he died down at your place, and then you came up.
We brought his body up here, and the tangi was held here.
Yeah. But then you found his books, or
well, Nora then took me into his office, his widow and Margie's mother, and showed me all these books that I'd never seen before. I'd been obsessively interested in history, always history across the world, but particularly New Zealand history. But I'd never seen these at all, and they were just a whole collection of books about iwi and hapu, well, particularly iwi tribal histories, written largely by Māori, not exclusively, but largely by Māori, and just phenomenal. But they were written regionally or tribally, so therefore, hence about Orohi or Takiwa. And as you read them and got closer to the treaty years, the musket started playing a big part, and you started to realise that the musket had played a huge part in terms of and having a massive effect on Māori customary warfare. So there'd been a tikanga, if you like, in Māori customary warfare, whereby essentially there was a north to south drift. If you take Ngāi Tahu, for example, they'd come from the east coast area where they share whakapapa with Ngāti Porou, and they'd come on down to the South Island, encountered Ngāti Māmoe, then encountered Waitaha, etc., as they moved on down south. And they were followed by Rangitani and Ngāti Apu and other iwi. And so there'd been that north-south sort of flow. And with the muskets, the same thing happened. So the tikanga of Māori customary warfare carried on, but suddenly you had one side, instead of having equality of arms, where essentially those processes had taken hundreds of years or numerous generations, suddenly in one generation, or in the space of a flick of an eye, really, in generational terms, in a year, you could have a complete subjugation of an iwi because one had muskets and the other didn't. And the effect was clearly dramatic. In terms of those tribal histories, you could see that effect. Either it was a dominant iwi and it did that, or it was a victim.
Were you picking up this sort of, because you would have started pretty much as a novice,
Absolutely.
you know, and so you were reading through all these various books of your father-in-law, and I'm sure it's like a puzzle that's been thrown on a table, and you're slowly putting pieces together, and so at what stage did you feel like you were going to bring enough information together to write a book? How did that?
Right. Well, look, it took me a long... Manga died in 1980. I inherited those books in 1980. We had young family then. I was trying to develop a practice as a barrister in a firm in those days. And so very busy with court work, very busy with my own sport. I played a lot of sport, and very busy with my children's sport, etc. So reading those books as and when I could, but also struggling with them because I didn't have good te reo in those days. Not that I necessarily have great te reo now, but I can read te reo pretty well now. I'm not great at conversational te reo. Margie's much better than I am. So the process took a long time, reading those books, so 10 years or so. It was quite a massive collection that he had. And so it took me a long, long time to read them all and to realise that there was no accessible way of interlinking those books. There was no account of the Musket Wars era. And so it started to occur to me really by the early 1990s that there was a real gap in the historiography in New Zealand and the literature whereby you could try and get a grasp of that era. And in those days there was no internet, etc. And so the gem of the idea was there, I suppose. And then through my legal work, I got involved in a case in Motueka where Governor Gray, with the best will in the world, when I think best will in the world sounds terrible because he then took I forget the detail of how he took it, but he essentially confiscated from Māori 1,000 acres of their best land at Motueka, invested it in a trust with the Anglican Church as the trustee to create a school to be able to educate Māori in English. It never worked because the Māori were so furious at their best lands being taken in Motueka, beautiful land, and so they never attended the school ever. And by the time I got involved, it had $11 million worth of assets, 247 houses, I remember that figure.
So you got involved from the legal aspect?
Because what happened was that the old bishops were very patronising to Māori, etc., and so they ran it for them in their best interests. They weren't actually getting any benefit from it, but that was the bishop's viewpoint. And then a young bishop came along, Bishop Eaton, and he could see this was awful, and he wanted to get it back to the descendants of the Māori owners, which was tricky. How on earth did you work out who were the descendants who could whakapapa to the original owners? And at that stage, by that stage, in about 1994, I realised that. Didn't realise then, but it became very apparent to me what were the consequences of Te Rauparaha's coalition coming down, because the two primary iwi who were identified in the Native Land Court minutes as being the owners at the time the land was taken were Ngāti Rārua and Te Ātiawa. And Ngāti Rārua, I knew, came from south of Kāwhia Harbour, and Te Ātiawa came from North Taranaki. So what on earth were they doing here, etc. So it was a classic lesson to me of the modern consequences of the effect of the musket. And so I started really researching for the purposes of that case about that invasion of Te Tauihu, the top of the south, by Ngāti Toa, etc. And as soon as you started doing that, you started realising that, Tamati Wakanene had come down with Ngāpui, picked up Te Rauparaha, taken him down to Whanganui Atara in 1819, and that's how he got to see Kapiti Island. That's how he got to know that Horowhenua was such a lovely place to live. And
That's where he figured out his plan B.
Because he knew that plan A, he was going to get a hiding by Tainui up and when he went back, So everything started to have a real practical effect on the ground in terms of a massive case that I was involved in. And so I drafted some legislation that went as special legislation to revest all that land in the descendants of Ngāti Rāru and Tātiawa, and that $11 million worth of assets they got back then, they've now converted into $40-50 million worth. It's a big enterprise. But that was the trigger. So I immediately started writing about the Musket Wars and immediately encountered problems of how did you do it? What were the chronological markers that you could rely on? Because the customary accounts don't give you those years. And so, again, to use that example of the coalition coming down under Te Rauparaha, of Tamati Wakanene bringing him down with Ngāpuhi, we can date that because we've got an objective Pākehā written record in that von Bellinghausen, which is a German name, but he's a Russian. The Russian von Bellinghausen took his sailing vessels through Cook Strait and recorded in his log seeing massive fires at Cape Terafiti being lit, which he described in his log to the natives trying to attract us ashore, which indeed they were. And you read Tamihana Te Rauparaha, the son of Te Rauparaha's account, and they saw the sails of two vessels sailing through Cook Strait. They lit, or Rukama as he calls it, and they lit the fires to try and entice them to come ashore and trade. So suddenly you've got a marker. And 1819 is the year that Tamati Wakanene comes down with Te Rauparaha. They raid up into the Wairarapa, etc. But it gives you a marker, and then you can start building things on that. He's then goes home. He then gets under pressure from Tainui, etc., and you're looking for other markers. And so that whole process of particularly trying to identify markers from known Pākehā records became a major factor in trying to piece it all together.
I think that's one of the, when the missionaries came here,
Aye.
all of a sudden, there was dates, you could, a war party has come back in September the 8th or something,
Exactly.
And they came out over the next 3 months or something. So certainly provided some objective dates for various events happening.
Absolutely. Yep. And they record the towers gathering together.
Yes.
They record the towers going away. And then 3 months, as you say, usually it was 3 or 4 months over the summer period, they would record the tower coming back with horrendous things. Tōreka, slaves galore who were often killed, etc., or baskets of flesh or whatever, So, which horrified them, but it was just part of Māori customary warfare.
So over that period, you're putting all this stuff together, and the idea of a book is formed in your mind, and then you get to the stage where you've got your manuscript. So take us from there. Right.
Well, even getting to the manuscript was interesting, and I won't spend too long on that. But the various events in my family, either family holidays with Māori, trips down to Dunedin with my daughter Huia to university or back, or with my son George, who was playing quite good squash nationally in those days and going to national tournaments everywhere. I'd take every opportunity I could to go to par sites, to go and look at the rivers they went down, to go and look at the coastal beaches where they landed, and the cliffs that would stop them going to the next beach, and all those sorts of things, so that looking at the country. And so by the time I got to write it, I had a pretty good mental picture of the great majority of the locations in both the North and South Island. And then, just wrote it in the evenings. I was a barrister still. Wrote it in the evenings, weekends, holidays, and then had a manuscript. But I didn't know what on earth you did with a manuscript. So Margie and I went overseas. I remember drawing the maps. My son George got in the New Zealand junior squash team. He was the captain of it, and I went with him. I was his coach, but I went with him, and those maps were drawn in a hotel room in Cairo, so they were just drawn from memory. And So I freehand drew all the maps, which then a very clever woman who's done most of the maps of most of my books, Jeanette Surridge, or now Jeanette Norman, very able cartographer, she turned them all into those beautiful maps, which numerous people and historians and schools and universities have asked permission to use, and we've allowed use of freely. And so those maps were a big thing, because to be able to understand the book, you needed those maps. And so when I got back from a later trip with Margie, she went on back to Blenheim and I stayed in Auckland for 2 days. I literally went into Queen Street, went into Whitcoulls and had a look at the New Zealand history section and pulled all the books out, or the recent books out that had been published in New Zealand, and a great majority of them were published by Reed Publishing. So I rang Reed's cold, and from a phone box in those days, no cell phones, and I remember from a phone box and feeding the phone box with coins and asking them whether or not they were interested, and they said they were, so to bring it over. So I went over and saw them, and met Peter Darling, who still publishes books and is publishing the book I'm working on at the moment, who was an editor in those days there, neat and highly intelligent fellow with a great interest in New Zealand history, and a chap, Peter Jansen, who was the managing editor at the time, and they both had the courage to take it on. And they sent it to Don Stafford, as I found out later, who I didn't realise that at the time, that they, just to check their own judgment, they sent it to Don Stafford, who looked at it and told them that, yeah, no, they should give it a go.
Don Stafford from Rotorua.
Yeah.
Whoa.
The man who wrote the Tarawa books, etc.
Yes.
And so they were very helpful and very constructive, and came back immediately saying, you know, you need a list of participants, because people are going to struggle with the Māori names and they'll get confused and they need to go back or have an ability. So you did take a name like Te Whakataupaka or whatever, and put a little 3-line summaries. Kaitahu from the South Island led Toa up to the north to attack Te Rauparaha, etc. And so little wee pen portraits as a list of participants. But importantly, they said you need a chronology, which was common for me in my barristerial work and court cases. So that was good and easy, and a good way of checking too that the text was accurate, etc. And so the chronology was done, list of participants, glossary, etc., and the maps. And they put me on to Jeanette Surridge, and she did a marvellous job. And but it all took time. And it was 1999 before it was published, and in those days, pre the internet, there were a huge number of newspapers and periodicals through the country, and they all did reviews, and there were 63 reviews done for the Musket Wars book, all positive, bar one, and that was interesting, because I'd been locked in litigation in fact, in the end, in the Privy Council with Tā Tipani O'Regan and Naito, who I was for a little northern iwi Ngāti Apa, and I had thought that he might not welcome a book written by this bloke who was on the other side in litigation. And to his eternal credit, because he wrote a wonderful review. He pointed out that I'd quite a lot of things wrong, and that's fine. You couldn't expect it to be perfect. But he basically concluded on the note that this is well overdue, should have been done before. And that was quite neat in a sense, because I had a concern, and I think the Reeds blokes did too, that what were Māori going to suddenly think when they hadn't been consulted, you know, the classic of lack of consultation, etc. But it was impossible to consult. How on earth could you have the time to go to all the hapu and iwi, which is impossible. And Tipani's reaction was great, because it was reflected by a number of the other reviews as well. But what it sort of highlighted to me and gave me some confidence really was that it probably was, and I don't think Tipani said it, but others did, that it was probably one of those rare Māori books on Māori customary warfare where only a Pākehā could write it, because he wasn't going to come from a biased position. Any if a Ngāpuhi had have tried to write it, they would have been, Tarawa would be saying that's just a Ngāpuhi story, etc. You know, and vice versa. And so I think it would have been very difficult. And I think that was highlighted by the one negative review that I got, which a Ngāpuhi chap wrote, and he said that I was obsessed by blood and that it was, you know, that I had it totally wrong, etc., and didn't realise that the Musket Wars were really all over by the late 1820s. Well, that was an Ngāpuhi view because they were dominant up until 1826 when Tainui suddenly got muskets themselves and then gave them their first hiding in the Waikato system in 1826. From then on, repetitively over the next 3 years, when they came down, they got a hiding and Tainui chased them back twice to Whangarei and to Tukaka, and that latter part is not recognised very often. But it was intriguing that he would say that, because if you look at Naito, for example, Kaiapoi, the big, huge event was in 1832. If you look at Pukerangiora, the big Tainui attack on Te Atiawa, that was in 1832. So these massive battles, which were every bit as devastating as any of the Ngāpuhi raids, occurred in the 1830s, and there was huge activity into the 1830s. 1836 to 1840, dominated by Tarawa and Ngaitarangi and the like. And so it did, those reactions gave me quite some sense of relief, really, that I wasn't attacked broadly or even really at all for being a Pākehā writing Māori history.
I think you share the same experience as I do when I'm telling these episodes of various events in the Musket Wars. It's coming from a Pākehā. So I can read up, you know, stuff that you know has a Taranaki bias, and then you get something with it, and you're trying to work out what you feel is the best, which I'm sure you had to do from the various. There's a lot of contradictory stuff that you come across, and you have to sort of try and filter out which is the most likely from your point of view.
Yeah, indeed, and that had to be done repetitively through the Musket Wars.
Yes.
If you had have tried to deal with it on, this is the Ngaitahu version, this is the northern version, you know, in each case, this is the Ngāpuhi version, this is the Tarawa version, etc., you would have needed a truck to cart the book around. The book is big enough as it is. I think it's about 380 pages or something like that. So I had to make decisions as best I could based on my knowledge of the geography on the ground, various marker points that you could identify in the Pākehā missionary records. Those missionary records were vital. Ship's logs, references, etc. Other Pākehā accounts that gave dates and the like. But often you had to be on the ground to work out what you thought was the reality of what was most likely to have happened. And I'm not saying I got that right, you know, it could well have got it wrong.
A lot of the times I get, when in my episode, someone will say, oh, you know, Kiwi culture doesn't know the truth. And you've got to think, truth, this is 200 years ago. You know, it came down to us through oral history, to normally told by someone like, you know, Percy Spencer and stuff like that, Percy Smith, sorry.
Yeah.
And who knows the truth? You kind of have to sort of just look at what's there and try and think, this is the most likely scenario, I think, and go from there.
Yeah. In fact, there's no, and what you're saying is so right, whether it's a court case or whether it's history, there's no absolute truth. There are likelihoods involved, and you have to look for the objective markers that support those likelihoods.
Now, may I say that book, when I came across it, was absolutely marvellous, because I've used that ever since as a reference. And from that, you can then go and look at, you know, the Polynesian journals and get others, obviously stuff that you've done. But a lot of those books, I love it whenever I send you an email, you'll come up with a book I've never heard of. There's a photo of something there that I thought, where the hell did they get? You probably got those from your father-in-law, did you?
Right. The great majority of them.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Now, you also have written another book on the Musket Wars, which was released in 2020. Tell me why you wanted to do that. It's called The Forgotten Wars, why they are relevant today.
Right. And the number of reasons for that. The long story is that whilst the reviews were favourable, quite often when I would do they weren't PowerPoints in those days, but I would do presentations using overheads, and they've now become PowerPoint presentations. And a number of Māori approached Margie, particularly my wife, or myself, and would say, why doesn't Ron write it in a chronological style, year by year by year throughout the country? I'm from Te Arawa. I don't want to know I don't want to have to read about what happened down in Mair-Te, etc., in the South Island. Why didn't you just write about what happened in Rotorua and in Tauranga, in that area where we were affected? So that was pretty common. Why didn't you write about just Taranaki, South Taranaki, Horowhenua, Hawke's Bay, East Coast, etc.? And the answer I was giving all the time was that it was the classic Pākehā approach that you write history chronologically, and they were all interrelated, and there were these waves coming down. But when I was writing it, that was one of the challenges. Did you try and write it chronologically, or did you try and write it regionally? And I decided regionally was impossible, because if you just take the Te Rauparaha situation, he gets forced out by Tainui from Kāwhia, comes down, winters over in North Taranaki, then goes on down to Horowhenua, captures Kapiti, then he goes across and starts raiding into the top of the South Island, then he goes way down the South Island. How can you write that regionally, was my thought. Well, in due course, I got approached by the Marlborough Boys College history teacher and other history teachers. In Marlborough, would I give, by that stage, PowerPoints had come along, would I give PowerPoints? And I was still a barrister at the time. And they were asking me, would I come along and do, no, it was overheads, sorry, overheads. Would I come along and do a presentation to the boys on the Musket Wars? And I remember the first telephone call well, because he said to me, so could you come along, would you be prepared to give us your time and come along? Oh, how long? I said, it's going to be difficult to do, because I'm a full-time barrister and I'd have to come for weeks on end, No, we just want you for one period. And I said, what do you mean? No, how long's the period? And he said, I said, what do you want? Do you want just the effect of the musket in Marlborough? No, we want a talk on the Musket Wars. And I said, what, in one period? I said, how long's a period? An hour? And he said, no, 40 minutes. And I said, I couldn't possibly do it in 40 minutes. And he said, well, you wouldn't have 40 minutes. You'd only have 20, because we want 20 minutes for the boys' questions. I said, oh, you're joking. You can't possibly do it. And he said, you can. I guarantee you can do it. And so he forced me to do it. And the first lecture I gave on it was to the Marlborough Boys College history class, 7th form history class, in 20 minutes on the Musket Wars. And the overheads were flipping fast, but I mean, and the boys were really engaged. So that was a bit of an eye-opener.
So that was sort of doing a little regional.
No, that was the whole of the Musket Wars. Yeah. And but then later he realised that it needed to be concentrated to Tauihu, and I was able to do that. But to do that again, you had to deal with Te Rauparaha coming down, etc. And so it wasn't particularly. It was regional in effect at the end, but it started up north, etc. You had to do that, and. So it convinced me, though, that you could actually do regional PowerPoints. And so I've done quite a few, or had done quite a few. And then the government announced that they were going to teach New Zealand history in New Zealand schools. Fantastic. Well overdue, decades overdue, and really neat. So when they put out the points for consultation, I expected to see the Musket Wars up there, right up front, and it wasn't there. There was a jump from the Pākehā sailors coming out and discovering New Zealand full of Māori who knew where it was, and then you jump to the Treaty Waitangi, and then you jump to the New Zealand Wars, and it was bizarre, because to understand where the rohi are and where the iwi and the hapu are, and we're spending billions of dollars justifiably settling treaty claims, to know where that funding is going, etc., and who the people are who have mana whenua in an area, you need to know what happened in the Musket Wars, and because that sets the scene for all the claims to mana whenua and throughout the country. So I couldn't believe it. So I thought, well, the only thing to do rather than grizzling and, I filed a submission, but there were thousands of submissions filed and might have just be another one. So I thought if I wrote a book, drawing attention to it, hopefully it would work, but it had to be smaller. It had to be much more readable because in essence, at the back of my mind was that students hopefully might use it if the Musket Wars got taught. So, and there was a real emphasis too in the curriculum consultation documents, and still is, I think, on, and I don't know that I agree with it, but there's a real emphasis on regional teaching, that you teach about what happens in your area. So it fitted that regional pattern, and you had the background of Māori people saying to Māori after the Musket Wars book came out, why did you write it on a chronological basis? Why not on a regional basis? So I put the book together on that basis, so that it hopefully was one that you could read about the effects in particular regions and how that flow, basically north to south, occurred, and then that left the outliers of the East Coast, etc. But they tended to get involved anyway at the end of the Musket Wars era, and so it was easier to deal with them as a separate chapter at the end. And touch wood, even though you don't get the reviews nowadays, so you don't know what the reviewers think, there's been good comment on it, and I've had a lot of direct feedback through correspondence and emails, etc.
So regarding the school curriculum, is there anything going to be taught on the Musket Wars as such?
Well, as I understand it, and I'm no great educational expert, and you've got to be an expert to read and understand the way education curricula are drawn. They're I think appalling there, but anyway, I'll move on.
We'll cut that. Right?
Yeah, exactly. But in essence, as I understand, the thrust of what the curriculum is requiring is expecting that teachers will inform themselves about what occurred in New Zealand history in their local area and teach it. Now, how on earth are you supposed to do that when you don't have, a Musket Wars background, etc., or a New Zealand Wars background, and how are you going to get that information, and whether you're going to get it in an objective sense that ensures that teaching is right, in quotes, rather than the history being right according to a particular iwi view, is a worry. And so I'm just hoping that book may be helpful to young teachers in an area. If they read a chapter in that book, they can get a reasonable feel for what the effect was of musket in that area.
And of course, if they go onto the Kiwi Codger channel, then
absolutely, and the Kiwi, and I push the Kiwi Codger to people because it's so visual. And nowadays, young people relate to visual things far better than reading a book. Yeah. And the advantage you give them with your droning is that they can actually physically see the sites, and then you've got a neat way of putting in routes, etc., which is great. So I just think what you're doing is fantastic. Yeah.
Well, Ron, that sounds like probably a very good place to bring this interview to a close.
Right.
And we must, there's so many topics that we could talk about and that we do talk about off camera that we'll get together and do this another time.
Fantastic.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, mate.
Nice to see you.
That's it.
Okay.
How we go for time?
Yeah, good. And just perfect. Yeah.
Right, let's...